So we are moving through seasonal changes, and this week's topic will be seasonal affective disorder. What it is, how it affects us, what we can do about it. In simple terms, I could just describe it that it's that amazing feeling when you go on a holiday, when within 2 days you feel just amazing because there's so much more sun than wherever the hell you are usually. So how can we use seasonal changes in our advantage instead of sometimes falling a victim to not the weather that we would prefer every single day? So I'll let you open up on that, key insights, what it is, how it happens, what we can do about it.
Most people, when they are going to be undiagnosed, right? Like most people are basically going to be self-diagnosed with seasonal affective disorder. Yeah, nobody, basically it's, hey, I'm just feeling subpar. I don't feel as lively anymore. I feel kind of dull. I feel semi-depressed. I can tell, my wife kind of has in the past suffered from it.
And before you go forward, would you say it's more of an adaptation for us to just slow the hell down because it's colder?
Well, so I'm going to argue against it if you know what you're doing, but the environment will do that as an adaptation. So you're 100% right. It's not a disorder, right? Like they label it as a seasonal affective disorder. It's not a disorder. It's an adaptation to the environment that you've induced. So you're 100% correct with that analogy of, hey, the reason you're getting this is because of the environment your body is in. You're eating and behaving like there's lots of sun, but you're not receiving it. So your body is literally lowering a lot of processes so that because it's not getting all the energy. Like people make a mistake of thinking that all of the energy that you need to function, not just like move around, but like your metabolism, right? And metabolism is not just your calories, it's everything that your body does. Your body is always under construction. Think of it that way, right? So there's always processes that you're not even aware of that are being done. In order to have enough energy for all of those to happen, it does not come completely from food. You would be eating all the time if that were to be happening. But when it's winter time, you are lacking a major contributor to free electrons, which is sunlight. And so that is the first thing that you're going to see is, hey, neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, get down-regulated. Their manufacturing gets down-regulated because it's not as easy to make those when you're lacking sunlight, but you're behaving like there is lots of sunlight, which means you're going to have a downturn in your mood, essentially, especially and again, it's never 2 weeks of that and now you have seasonal affective disorder. It's usually over the course of about 6 weeks, right? It takes a little while. The sunlight gets lower and lower. It starts getting colder outside. You start predominantly being indoors, but you continue to eat the same and you never really experience any cold. And so your body is waiting. It's waiting for sunlight. It's waiting for sunlight. And eventually 6 weeks comes and then it's like, there's no sunlight coming. We need to start down regulating the processes or we're going to run out of fuel. And that's when it starts. Okay. Now, just like you said, I don't classify it as a disorder. I classify it as your behaviors have induced this particular result, which also means that different behaviors can undo it. Okay. And this is why I say my wife used to suffer from it. There are some things that you can do that basically make it almost non-existent, depending on how well you execute on these, right? So this introduces us to a hormone that we haven't talked a little bit. We've referred to it a little bit here and there, and that's leptin. Okay. Now, a lot of people might have heard about leptin or read about leptin, and it's a hormone that's embedded in your subcutaneous fat layer. Okay, so that's where it exists. Okay, and it gets liberated when you liberate white adipose tissue, so white fat. Okay, but what does it do, right? What is it? The leptin receptor is basically a way to shift. It's basically the hormone that allows mammals to live in two environments: a sunlight dominant environment and a cold dominant environment. We all know that there's no dinosaurs outside, okay? Why is there no dinosaurs? We can all agree, whether it was an asteroid or climate change or whatever, right? Whatever you choose that the science proves to you, the point is somehow it got cold. Somehow not enough plants were being made for dinosaurs to continue to live, right? It got too cold for them, and that's the end of it. How that happened, it's debatable, whatever you want to go there. But the point is, it got cold. Dinosaurs couldn't survive because they're cold-blooded. Mammals could because they're warm-blooded. And that's kind of where people leave it. But the problem is, if it's just about being warm, then how do all the hormones and processes in your body continue to function? You know, because again, there's no lights back then, right? It's just sunlight and cold. Well, if it's cold permanently, how does your body continue to function? And leptin is probably one of these receptors that started to be introduced at that time in evolution to shift the central nervous system, the CNS, the central climactic nucleus in the brain of all mammals, to pay attention to cold and regulate and tune your circadian rhythm and your circadian biology to cold versus light, because of this simple mechanism. When you induce cold, you will release body fat because it's a stress response. Cold is a stress response, just like sunlight is a stress response, okay? So they're both stress responses of the environment. Cold releases body fat for your mitochondria to make heat, aka you're warm-blooded, okay? When it releases body fat, it also releases the leptin, okay? So it's a key marker of, hey, when it got cold enough that we needed to make more heat and release body fat, we're also going to release leptin. When leptin gets released, what it does is it starts shifting the circadian mechanism for sleep and metabolism. So in other words, your sleep starts to get changed and your metabolism starts to get changed. And you got to pay attention to the word metabolism, because it's not just your calories that you're expending. It's the rate at which you make things, right? You're under construction all the time. Your body is always turning over cells and making new cells. That's what metabolism actually is. It's the rate at which your city shrinks and grows, okay? And that directly makes something called endothelial nitric oxide. So cold releases leptin through the fat that's being released, and it also makes endothelial nitric oxide. And those two coupled together do something pretty unique. It blunts cravings for carbohydrates because there shouldn't be any carbohydrates when it's cold. This is a mechanism, right? Like, think about it. How did everybody before, 50 years ago, when you could go to the grocery store and buy carbs all the time year round, how did they survive? How did they not go nuts with cravings of I want, carbohydrates every afternoon or every evening in the winter?
I can tell you how we survived. We didn't have any fridge or anything. We were just storing everything in underground cellars, so to speak. And things we could store that were carbs were potatoes and apples. That's about it. That's as far as it went. Maybe some beetroot, because we didn't really grow anything else in where I was living. There were no other really crops, or you certainly didn't make any pasta.
Correct. Right. That's just not a thing. And then the behaviors around those carbohydrates were not the same behaviors. Like, oh, I need my potato. I'm craving my potato every evening or whatever. It was like, no, this is just kind of what's part of the deal. Your craving and your behavior around food changes when there's lots of cold around because of these two things that are being liberated, leptin and endothelial nitric oxide. They basically blunt the hypothalamus and to lower the drive for carbohydrates. This is a natural behavior when you induce cold, okay? So the other thing that happens when you induce cold is you have to, liberate body fat and transport more body fat because that's going to be your main, secondary fuel source for surviving, right? Like, there's no guarantee that you're going to, like right now, obviously in the modern world, there's a guarantee we're going to have food, but that's not what cold signals to the biology, right? So what it does is it actually reverses 180 degrees everything that happens in the winter. Okay, so in the winter, or I mean, sorry, I misspoke. Cold reverses 180 degrees everything that happens in the summer. Okay, so in high sunlight environments, there's lots of carbohydrates. You can eat a lot of them. It's perfectly fine to do that. And then as the winter gets shorter, the light gets shorter, the summer gets shorter, then you start to induce a little bit of insulin resistance to store some body fat. Okay, and then finally, when it gets cold, it flips that around so that you're no longer storing body fat and you're releasing body fat. And in order to do that, you have to upregulate something called VEGF. And some people may have heard it, maybe in your other podcasts and stuff. And VEGF is vasoendothelial growth factor. That basically means that you're going to proliferate more blood cells, more blood flow to everything. Because one of the key things when you're trying to burn body fat is blood flow. It's being able to transport those. The other thing that it will release is it's going to release more growth hormone, because growth hormone saves muscle mass and continues to release more body fat. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to raise the efficiency of autophagy. Okay. This is very popular with a lot of people about fasting and stuff like that. Well, cold does this automatically, and it doesn't take very long to induce this. I'll talk a little bit about like what it takes. It's basically anywhere from about 3 to 10 minutes daily of 50-degree sensory at the skin. That's what it takes. After about 2 weeks, you've released plenty of leptin into the system from the acute release of body fat at those times to basically start this process of blunting carbohydrate cravings and stuff like that. Now, something that will happen immediately after the cold exposure is dopamine goes up, noradrenaline goes up, and enough noradrenaline can turn into adrenaline, and the cortisol response gets regulated. This little bit right here is actually key to the opening statement of seasonal affective disorder, right? What I said is, hey, you're still behaving like it's warm outside. In other words, your body doesn't understand that it's cold outside. Why doesn't it understand that? Because you're not releasing leptin, you're not releasing dopamine at a specific time of day, or noradrenaline at a specific time of day. It's the morning when it's the most specific, because the entrainment of cold versus light for a mammalian biology is, when does the day start and when does the day end, right? Whether you're nocturnal or diurnal, you need to know those two times or your circadian biology gets messed up. So biology, mammalian biology, has figured out that the coldest time of every single 24-hour period is the morning. I mean, you don't even have to, you can Google it. Like, you can just Google your local weather and you will see that the coldest point in time is every single morning. Okay. That's why biology can be shifted to cold to use for its circadian master clock when there is very little sunlight outside. Cold will induce, hey, this is the start of the day. This is when we should release cortisol. This is when we should release dopamine. This is when, if you're a diurnal creature, your biology is set up this way. Why? Because all of these things program you for activity and well-being throughout the day. High dopamine, now you can think clearly. Now you can respond and follow patterns. Noradrenaline can make you a little bit more active, quite a bit more active. Cortisol will also flow in releasing body fat. You see, all of these line up that, hey, that was the start of the day. You're a diurnal creature. These should be released. That's what cold exposure in the morning will do acutely every single time you execute it. So for somebody with seasonal affective disorder, those are the things at the beginning of this episode, those are having downward pressure when you live a warm lifestyle, but you're spending it all day inside because there's very little sunlight outside, right? Seasonal affective disorder over a long period of time can lead to depression, aka I never go outside. I work in front of a computer every single day and I don't have any windows. You see how they one can turn into something else, right? Seasonal affective disorder usually just affects people acutely because they tend to go outside every, once spring comes around and summer comes around. But some people, they don't understand that their seasonal affective disorder turned into some kind of depression through some kind of life event or some kind of lifestyle.
And it's much easier to do it now because work from home and so many fears pushed on you and this and that, and we both know the longer you force someone to be a certain way, the more of a chance of them staying there. Same with weight gain or fat loss or whatever. You don't gain fat by overeating calories once a week. You do it by doing it consistently over and over and over and over again until that becomes kind of your normal stuff. But yeah, yes. So, and I think misconception as well is sometimes that people perceive fat storage as almost an illness, when in reality it just shows how effective your body is at adapting to what you do to it. But people don't understand that you need to stop doing these things to your body because it doesn't serve the purpose anymore, because we have food accessible all year round now.
Correct. So yeah, I mean, all of that is 100% true. It's the unfortunate truth that people don't want to hear, or they know, but they just don't want to accept it, which is, hey, this is happening to me because of the behaviors I have, right? And behaviors are hard to change, don't get me wrong, but they are in fact behaviors that, there are some few exceptions here, right? And this is what kind of leads me, this is the kind of a perfect spot, okay? Cold shifts your biology away from light and to cold. It basically turns the dial towards cold. It doesn't turn it off, right? It just means, hey, now we're predominantly obeying cold. And one of the things that I've talked, this is the one exception of like, hey, this may not be a behavior thing. It may be a environmental situation thing, which is what we've talked about in the past in a few episodes, which is electromagnetic fields, right? How those are a form of light, right? So why do you think some people experience a lot of relief from electromagnetic fields when they start inducing cold? Because it's a form of light. And when you use cold, you turn the dial away from being too sensitive to any form of light, because your body doesn't understand the difference between sunlight or, this fake light that I have here, or the Wi-Fi, right? Those are all forms of light, okay? But when you induce cold, you're automatically changing the biology and making it less sensitive to light, all forms of light, including man-made light, like Wi-Fi, cellular networks, etc. It is a workaround, depending on, how aggressive, right? If you're really close to like a bunch of cell phone towers, it's probably not going to do a whole lot. But if you, work from home and you have a lot of Wi-Fi around, or you live in an apartment building and, there is Wi-Fi permanently around because of other tenants, cold can be helpful to entrain your circadian rhythm, because that's one of the things that electromagnetic fields disrupts. The first thing it disrupts is your circadian rhythm. Cortisol response starts to become too high, too out of control. It starts to shunt DHEA to that and not your sex hormones, things of that nature, right? So that's part of your circadian rhythm. Cold can bring that back down and keep it in check, because you're going to turn off the sensitivity to light. That's something that people don't really understand, but that's basically the function of how cold exposure and why it's become so popular, and why people say, I just feel better. Anecdotally, this is what they're experiencing. Their circadian rhythm is now lining up to what it should have been. They don't understand that there's probably a secondary mechanism that was making it bad to begin with, right? Which is electromagnetic fields. Now, so that was just a little tidbit in that conversation. And then another thing, it only takes about 2 to 3 weeks to elicit or start eliciting this effect. So in other words, if you're somebody who chronically gets seasonal affective disorder, start 2 or 3 weeks before you feel like you're going to get it, and you might not experience it at all, because that's when you will entrain the body to do that. And then after that, it's just a matter of experiencing 50 degrees or less, basically. So
and that's something we mentioned in previous videos. Don't think that you need to go in a cold plunge. Start with just cold water on your face to begin with, and build yourself up, because a lot of people still will try to find cryotherapy, and they will list many things as why they can't do it. When in reality, you just go in your bathroom and use a bit of cold water to start your adaptation to cold and build it from there.
Absolutely. And then another thing that cold will do, right? We talked about growth hormone, IGF-1, vasoendothelial growth factor, appetite suppression. The other thing it does is it also increases GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. That means sex hormones go up when you start inducing cold, just like when you start getting a lot of sunlight on your skin, you don't release GnRH with sunlight. What you do is you just sulfate more cholesterol to make more sex hormones. But with cold, you actually release more GnRH, which stimulates the production. So some doctors try to do this, right, with HCG, with GnRH, sometimes with direct LH or FSH. You can do this for free with cold. Okay, you can do this for free with cold. It actually starts to push reproductive fitness better. Something that most people, and you may even see, is people that are obese or have leptin, because if you're obese or overweight, you are leptin resistant. That comes before insulin resistance. If you're leptin resistant, that literally means you have very little GnRH signaling. Most obese people have a problem being fertile. They can't conceive very easily. This is one of the reasons, and it starts with releasing the leptin and inducing all the cascades that I've just named, because I'm naming them from the top down. Basically, these are the things that happen first, second, third, and fourth. One of the fourth thing that happens is GnRH starts to be released, so sex hormones start to go up. So that's also a thing. In fact, I know a guy, one of my clients, that he's 57 years old, has a testosterone level of 900. The first time I read his blood work, I was like, "Are you on testosterone replacement therapy?" He's like, "No, I'm not. I just do a friend of mine introduced me to cold plunges, and I've been doing that for a couple of years." I'm like, "Interesting." I'm like, "You do it year round?" He's like, "Yeah, I do." I'm like, "Well, keep doing that, because he's 56 years old, a testosterone level of 900. I seriously, at first,
and we see it usually the opposite way around when they're like 20 something and their testosterone is completely tanked. And then you start talking to them, what's where, how. Oh yeah, last 10 years I've been sitting at home smoking weed and playing PlayStation. You're like, wow, okay. We need to figure your life out. There's nothing to do with your testosterone declining. You are declining as a human being. You just need to figure that out.
Exactly. And that's one of the things. And then some people also, the testosterone number also isn't the final thing. It's also receptor affinity, right? And so leptin is actually something that demonstrates this every season if you do it correctly. Leptin will be the reason why I say it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get kind of adapted and get these hormonal cascades going in the right direction, is because that's how long it takes for leptin to get released in a major way from all this acute body fat release that you're doing, even if you're not burning body fat. So even if you're eating in a surplus, you're still going to release that body fat into the bloodstream, which means you're still going to release the leptin hormone. Okay. So that's a key thing for people to understand. Just getting in the cold will release the body fat, even if it gets stored again later. But that's what you want, because you're trying to release the leptin that's in the fat cells to get distributed to your brain and everything else to turn on this pathway. Okay. When that happens, there is a lot of leptin that's being in these first 2 or 3 weeks. So what your body does is it upregulates receptor affinity and receptor density for the leptin receptor. And remember, leptin is a cortisol backbone hormone, just like sex hormones. Okay. So what this demonstrates is why would this happen? Why would receptors go up and affinity go up with a whole lot of that hormone around? Because that's how hormone receptors, steroid receptors, function. The more of it around, the more of it needs to be used up to signal a big change in the environment. Okay. This also leads to something that me and you have discussed, and other people in the field of fitness. Hey, when you do a steroid cycle, is it better to taper up or have boluses. This is an argument for having large boluses at the beginning of cycles to upregulate receptor affinity and receptor density that then later suck up any lower dosages that you have. This actually works in leptin, just like this. And it raises leptin sensitivity, right? Which is the first step in undoing any kind of diabetes or any kind of other things like that where you're storing energy. Because leptin is also, leptin, I mentioned, is something that yokes your metabolism and your sleep. It changes how those function. The other thing that it does secondarily is it tells the body how much energy you have stored, because it's in the fat. When you release a lot of body fat, lots of leptin goes up, leptin sensitivity goes up. That tells the brain, hey, we have plenty of fuel. Let's do all these things that I mentioned. Let's release a lot of growth hormone. Let's start releasing a lot of GnRH so we can make a lot of sex hormones, because this person has clearly done a good job over the summer and fall months of eating enough food and having plenty of body fat, that they're healthy, right? Because think of it, if you didn't have very much body fat, you weren't well off in the summer, you wouldn't release very much leptin because you wouldn't have very much body fat. So then your body would not switch over very well to producing a lot of sex hormones and a lot of growth hormone. But we know that that's not the case. Everybody's pretty healthy as far as like the amount of food intake, right? And so now in the winter is a perfect time to induce and tell the body, hey, we've done a really good job of consuming enough food. Let's release a lot of this. Let's flip it over to this other system and really become a superhuman in a situation where most people feel that you can't be superhuman.
So from all this, seasonal affective disorder seems like, okay, this is not something that is harmful or whatnot. It just shows you what your body is capable of. And it brings me to a question. For somebody who's trying to optimize their muscle growth, would it be the best to try store a little bit of body fat throughout the summer and then try to lean up and eat as much protein as possible through the winter, because your growth hormone is increased now, you're eating less carbs, so you have less inflammation? Would you build more muscle, not trying to force to be as big as you can, but try to eat as, let's say, clean and high protein nutrition as possible throughout the winter?
It will say that your recovery ability will go much better, right? Inflammation will be lower, growth hormone will be higher. You will basically be, if you can obey those rules and get some cold exposure, you will be able to recover better and build more muscle tissue. Your ability to do that potentially will go up, yes. And more importantly, if you know that, right, and you do need to get bigger, you focus on the foods that actually drive more of that, right? So in the winter, carbohydrates aren't going to be the main driver. You're going to actually do it with fatty sources of meat, and the fats will drive that. Why? Because the cold exposure actively starts to bias the system into using not just body fat, but fat in general for more fuel, right? This is, some people call it being fat adapted. And basically those types of people just tell you, hey, you just got to eat fat for a long time. And eventually your body figures out how to use it. It's way simpler than that, way simpler than that. Induce cold first. The fat adaptation comes naturally, because that's the thing that signals all the correct hormones and all the correct neurotransmitters to know, hey, body fat or fat in general should be the thing that we're using up as much as possible. So yes, this is where you can eat a really high protein diet with lots of animal fats and sparingly eat veggies and things that you can store, like potatoes, root vegetables, things of that nature, to fuel acute performances like training at the gym and stuff like that. And yeah, you start to manipulate kind of both worlds there at that time. You can take that a step further. You use cold exposure to keep their circadian rhythm entrained in that way, and you supplement acutely, just periodically with some red light and a little bit of UV light. And now what you end up experiencing is almost like a paradigm that nature doesn't do, which is cold with UV light. It does happen only in one place on the planet. That's the Himalayas, which also happens to be where people live for a long time for some reason. It also happens to be where people have extreme human fitness, right? Monks, Sherpas, they all have really extreme abilities that science really doesn't comprehend. Why? Because that environment is cold and it's so high that you still get UV light. You still get UV light. All those people are dark and tan because they still get UV light, but their environment is cold. So you can start inducing this synthetically where your immune system is now much higher than it should be because UV light actually regulates the immune system through alpha MSH and POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, which we've talked about before. And that, I'll just actually share this real quick. Here it is. So right now you're looking at this guy right here, alpha MSH. I'll zoom in a little bit. Alpha MSH dictates appetite, energy homeostasis, and sexual activity. And it also dictates melanin production and protects against ischemia and things of that nature. ACTH at the very top regulates glucocorticoids and other things. So all of these are dictated by sunlight. They're broken up by sunlight. So when you can still have UVA and UVB in your life, you're getting the benefits of this stuff here, along with the benefits of the cold. So the cold raises immunity via a different pathway, and the UV light raises immunity from a different pathway. So you're getting a two-way combo there. You can also flip this around in the spring and in the summer. You can induce cold with cold plunges, and you take advantage of free UV and UVA. So this is where, when you know what you're doing, the modern world can facilitate a superhuman lifestyle by knowing what you take away at what time of year and what you add in at what time of year. You see what I'm saying? So in the cold, if you live somewhere where it gets cold every year, well, you get free cold. So you start using that for free, and you start inducing a little bit of synthetic UVA and infrared light, because infrared light raises ATP production just by the light interacting with you, right? And in the cold, you don't bias towards ATP production. The cold actually raises energy and metabolism through these functions that I explained earlier in the video. Cortisol going up, dopamine going up, noradrenaline going up. Okay, it raises it through hormone direct action, right? Which is kind of what drug users do, right? They raise metabolism through hormone direct action by injecting it into them. Well, you can do this at a pretty aggressive level with just cold. You can supplement it with drugs. Do I get involved in some of that? Yeah, there is some of that going on with some of the people that I coach for this reason. We can augment it. Then you supplement with some specific lighting to continue to get a 1 + 1 = 3 type of scenario.
Yeah, and it's an addition, whereas most people will try to just override it all and think, I just need to take all these million things and they're going to make me amazing. And more often than not, they just harm themselves without even knowing that.
Yes,
and it's very interesting.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm glad you pointed that out. At no point in time, these lights, right? I have a UV light, purple light, black light, whatever you want to call it, UVA, and an infrared light. At no point in time have I ever told anybody these substitute the sun. They cannot. They are supplemental lighting because of the conditions of existence of, hey, there isn't as much sun now, so I'm going to supplement it so that I can get a different effect because I'm still getting outside and getting cold, right? And then I flip it the other way around come spring and summer. I actually don't use these very much. I just use the sun, right? And I get cold on purpose, either taking a cold shower or getting in a cold plunge or getting in a cold lake, any of those things, to induce and continually run both pathways together.
And it's still quite a new lifestyle for humans to live the way we are living now. Like, I am not that old, and I was living in post-Soviet Union country where you had to go out and get the water from a well. You didn't have warm water. You had to wash anyway. You washed in cold stuff. In the winter, you didn't have anything plant-based, so you had to eat meat. And funnily enough, usually the biggest, strongest people are from those kind of countries because they still live like how people call them third world countries. but they are stronger and fitter because of it, because that's a natural way of living. And if people can kind of adapt that and use everything we have access to now, they can be probably multiple times better than was possible before. And probably that's why we still see so many Olympic game and whatever records just fall in left, right, and center. Yes, there are drugs involved as well, obviously, but things are so advanced, and I believe human potential is still nowhere near reached.
No, absolutely. And something I'm going to add to that, right? The biggest humans on the planet usually come from cold climates. It's not a coincidence. What did I just explain? Cold bias towards lots of growth hormone, lots of sex hormones, etc., lots of affinity for those things. Why? Because a bigger body can produce more heat. It will survive easier in a cold environment. It's a fundamental evolutionary adaptation. It's not a coincidence. It's not, oh, they're Russian, or oh, they're Icelandic. So no, they're cold adapted people because they experience cold I guarantee you, anybody living in that country that doesn't experience cold regularly does not get as big as people that do, because of this simple adaptation. When you run on cold, you're actively selecting hormones that will make you bigger. It's not a coincidence.
No, this has been really insightful as usual. And the biggest takeaways would be that seasons are changing. Use them in your advantage. You know, just
Absolutely.
not falling for the victim. Everything is in your own control. Just reach out and maximize the potentials that environment gives you.
Yes.
There are benefits and weaknesses in any kind of circumstances. Milk out the benefits, try to minimize the negative effects, and you'll be better off than majority of people.
Absolutely. And kind of like as a broad overview to kind of tie it back to seasonal affective disorder, start inducing cold, start experiencing the actual environment outside, start reducing carbohydrates, bringing in a little bit more proteins and fats from animal sources, because those are what exists in the cold, so that your sex hormone and neurotransmitter production is nice and high. The cold will facilitate the making of those hormones and signaling for making those neurotransmitters and those hormones, and then supplement a little bit with a little bit of UVA and a little bit of infrared A. That's really as hard as it needs to be. One thing I would discourage big time that's popular is buying one of those really, really bright lights that you shine in your face for seasonal affective disorder. It will acutely work, but the problem is the way it works is long-term detrimental, because all it does is raises a stress response, which raises cortisol. And that's what makes you feel okay for several weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. The longer you use it, the more downward pressure it will put on DHEA being sucked into cortisol, and then your sex hormones tank, and then you end up in more of a slump. Why? Because there wasn't cold to switch over from the lighting scenario. Cold is the one thing you don't want to skip. If you don't do anything else, you don't want to skip the cold. Yeah.
Awesome, David. Thanks for your time as usual, and I'll see you next video.
Awesome. Thank you.